It is a Sunday morning in August of 1971, and a young man named Doug Corpy is lying on the floor of a 6 by 9-foot cell in the basement of the Jordan Hall Psychology Building at Stanford University. He has been there for less than 36 hours. He is not a prisoner. He volunteered for this. He answered a newspaper advertisement that promised $15 a day to participate in a 2-week study of prison life. He passed the psychological screening. He was assessed as stable, normal, healthy, and now he is on the floor screaming, not performing distress, not exaggerating for effect, screaming in a way that the graduate students monitoring him through a small camera in the corner of the room would later describe as terrifying. The kind of sound that you do not make unless something inside you has genuinely broken. He's tearing at his hair. He is pressing his hands against his face. He is crying and shouting, and his body is doing things that bodies do when a mind is trying to escape itself. And there is nowhere to go. The man who designed the study that put him there is sitting in a room down the hall watching. Philip Zimbardo, 38 years old, professor of psychology, a man who had spent his career thinking carefully about what institutions do to people, is watching one of his participants come apart at the seams, and his first instinct is not to open the cell. His first instinct is to wonder if Corpy is faking it. That instinct, that small, cold, clinical hesitation, is what this story is really about. Not what happened to the prisoners, not what happened to the guards, what happened to the man watching, what the situation did to someone who was supposed to be above it. And the question that his hesitation quietly places in front of you right now is this. If you had been there sitting in that room watching that monitor, holding authority over a person who was falling apart, would you have opened the cell, or would you too have found a reason to wait? That question is not rhetorical. There are studies that answer it. The data is specific and it is not flattering, and it is exactly these kinds of questions, the ones that make us squirm because they implicate us personally, not society, not other people, but us, that the human code was built to answer. Philip Zimbardo grew up in the South Bronx in the 1940s, in conditions that would have predicted a very different life trajectory. He was poor. He was often sick. He spent time in a hospital ward as a child, which he would later identify as one of his first visceral encounters with institutional power. The way a building and a set of rules and a uniform on a person in authority could transform the dynamic between human beings completely. He recovered. He was brilliant. He won a scholarship. He went to college, then to graduate school at Yale, then into academia, and he built a career on a single obsessive question. Why do good people do terrible things? He was not asking this as an abstract philosophical puzzle. He had grown up watching people he knew personally, neighbors, friends, classmates, end up on very different sides of the law, the classroom, the social hierarchy, with no obvious explanation from their character or their intentions. He believed, with the conviction that drove his entire career, that the traditional psychological framework was wrong. Psychology at the time was dominated by what he called dispositional thinking. The idea that behavior is primarily explained by who a person is, their traits, their character, their internal moral structure. Bad people do bad things. Good people do good things. What Zimbardo believed instead was that situations, the environments we are placed in, the roles we are assigned, the rules and expectations that structure our context, could override character almost completely, could take a person who had never done a cruel thing in their life and turn them into someone they would not recognize. He wanted to prove it, and in the summer of 1971, he designed an experiment to do exactly that. The method was straightforward in concept and alarming in execution. Zimbardo and his colleagues, including Craig Haney and Curtis Banks, placed a newspaper advertisement in the Palo Alto Times and the Stanford Daily, recruiting male college students for a 2-week psychological study of prison life. The advertisement was deliberately plain. It offered $15 a day, which was meaningful money in 1971. It mentioned that the study would involve some psychological stress. 75 young men responded. Zimbardo and his team screened all of them. Physical and psychiatric examinations, personality tests, interviews. They selected 24 men who scored most solidly in the middle of every measure. Not anxious, not aggressive, not authoritarian, not submissive. The most psychologically average young men they could find. The most normal. A coin flip divided them. 12 would be prisoners, 12 would be guards. The prisoners were not told in advance exactly when the study would begin. This was deliberate. On Sunday, August 14th, 1971, Palo Alto police officers arrived at the homes of the men assigned to be prisoners and arrested them. Real arrests, with real police cars and real handcuffs and real neighbors watching from doorways and driveways. They were charged with armed robbery or burglary, read their rights, searched, and taken to the station. Then they were blindfolded and transported to the basement of Jordan Hall, which Zimbardo's team had converted into a mock prison over the preceding weeks. Doors had been replaced with real jail bars. A small solitary confinement closet had been designated as the hole. The cells were 6 feet by 9 feet. 3 men to a cell. No windows. When the prisoners arrived, they were stripped. They were deloused with a spray. They were dressed in smocks, loose garments with no underwear beneath, with a number stenciled on the front and back. They wore rubber sandals. They were given a light chain to wear around one ankle, which had no function except to remind them constantly, physically, of their status. They were assigned not names, but numbers. They were told the rules. They would be referred to by number at all times. They would eat only at meal times. They could use the bathroom only at scheduled times. They could speak to a guard only by raising their hand and asking permission. They had no rights. They had only privileges, which could be revoked. The guards had been given almost no specific instructions. This was also deliberate. Zimbardo told them only that they were to maintain order, that they were not to use physical violence, and that they had the authority to do essentially whatever they felt was necessary to achieve control. They were given khaki uniforms. They were given wooden batons, which they were not told to use, only to carry. They were given mirrored sunglasses, which Zimbardo had specifically requested because he wanted to prevent eye contact, to dehumanize the interaction from the start, to make the guards opaque in a way that prisoners could not be. The sunglasses were his idea, and it is worth sitting with that detail for a moment, because it means that Zimbardo, the researcher, the person whose job was to observe, had already made a design choice that would make cruelty easier. The study was supposed to run for 2 weeks. By the second day, the guards had already begun improvising cruelties that no one had suggested to them. Push-ups as punishment. A practice borrowed from actual military prisons that none of the guards had discussed with each other, but that several independently adopted. Roll calls at 2 in the morning. Not because anything needed to be checked, but because it was a way to exert dominance over sleeping people. Prisoners were made to line up and recite their numbers. They were made to do jumping jacks. They were told to insult each other. One guard, who would become known in the study's records by his nickname, John Wayne, developed a personal style of drawn-out, deliberate humiliation that the other guards began to emulate. He had been, before the study began, a quiet young man with no history of cruelty. Within 48 hours, he was inventing new ways to make people feel small, and the other guards were watching him the way you watch someone who has figured out a skill you are still learning. This is the part that tends to get reported as the study's central finding, but it is not. The guards becoming cruel is disturbing, but it is also, in some dark way, not surprising. What the Stanford Prison Experiment actually found, its true, deeply uncomfortable revelation, is more specific and more personal than that. On the first day, prisoner number 8612, whose real name was Douglas Corpy, began to act out. He was rebellious and defiant, refusing to follow rules, talking back, encouraging the other prisoners to resist. The guards responded with harassment, with push-ups, with confinement. By the morning of the second day, something had shifted. Corpy was no longer rebelling. He was disintegrating. He was experiencing what appeared to be an acute emotional breakdown, confusion, crying, rage that seemed to be consuming him from the inside rather than aimed at anyone in particular. He begged to be released. He said he could not take it anymore. He asked to see a priest. Zimbardo and his colleagues looked at the footage. They discussed it. and they did not release him immediately. They wondered whether it was a performance. They discussed the possibility that Corpy was trying to fake his way out of the study to collect information and undermine it. One researcher said something along the lines of, "He's a good actor." They brought him out and told him that if he agreed to be an informant to report on the other prisoners in exchange for certain considerations, they would keep him in the study. He refused. And then, after extended discussion and deliberation, they let him go. He had been there for 36 hours. What happened to Zimbardo in those 36 hours is not incidental to the story. It is the story. Zimbardo had not remained the objective observer. He had become the prison superintendent. He was no longer thinking primarily as a researcher whose job was to protect his participants. He was thinking as a person with an institutional role, with an investment in maintaining the structure he had created. The experiment, the institution, had begun to own him in the same way it was owning everyone else. He would admit this later. Years later in his book, The Lucifer Effect, he would write about it with a clarity that is both admirable and chilling. The recognition that he had lost himself inside the role, that the situation had captured him as completely as it had captured the guards and the prisoners. He had designed the cage and ended up inside it. By the third day, the prisoners had largely stopped being rebellious. Something more disturbing had replaced the rebellion: compliance. Not grudging compliance, not silent resistance, actual deference. Prisoners began to internalize the logic of the prison. They began to believe, on some level, that they deserved their treatment, that the rules were legitimate, that the guards had the right. When prisoner 819 was in tears after being harassed, and a guard told the other prisoners to chant that 819 was a bad prisoner who had made things worse for everyone, the prisoners did it. They chanted against their fellow prisoner. They had been there for 3 days. A graduate student named Christina Maslach, who was also, at the time, Zimbardo's girlfriend and would later become his wife, came to the prison on the 5th day to conduct interviews. She had not been involved in the study to that point. She walked through the basement. She watched the guards march the blindfolded prisoners to the bathroom late at night, a humiliation exercise. Prisoners with bags over their heads being shuffled through a corridor. And she became so distressed that she confronted Zimbardo directly and said, "What you were doing to those boys is a terrible thing." Zimbardo has said that it was her confrontation, her refusal to be absorbed into the institutional logic, that finally broke his own trance. He ended this study the next day, on the 6th day, August 20th, 1971. It had been designed to run for 14 days. Now here is the finding that tends to get buried beneath the dramatic narrative, the one that matters most for understanding what this experiment actually tells us about human nature. When researchers followed up with the participants in the months and years afterward, they found something in the psychological profiles of the guards that is far more troubling than the cruelty itself. The guards who had been most brutal, the ones who had invented new forms of harassment, who had seemed to relish the power, were not, in their post-study interviews, showing signs of guilt or shame. They were showing signs of something else. They were showing signs of having found, in their behavior, a logic that satisfied them. They had not done something wrong and known it. They had done something wrong, and it had felt right. This is not a story about monsters who were hiding among us. This is a story about a mechanism inside ordinary people that can make monstrous behavior feel not only acceptable, but righteous. And now you are sitting wherever you are sitting, and you are thinking what most people think at this exact moment: I would not have done that. I would have recognized what was happening. I would have been like Christina Maslach, the person who walked in from outside, who could see clearly, who said stop. Maybe. But the data has something specific to say about that belief, and it is worth hearing it fully, without rushing past it. In the years following the Stanford Prison Experiment, a pattern emerged in follow-up studies and related research that is one of the most replicable findings in the psychology of moral behavior. The people who scored highest on measures of moral certainty, the people who, before being placed in a morally compromised situation, were most confident they would resist, most certain about their own integrity, were consistently reliably more likely to comply than the people who expressed doubt. The confident ones, the ones who said without hesitation, I would never do that. Those were the people who did it. The researchers who looked at this pattern over and over gave it different names in different contexts. Jonathan Haidt described the broader mechanism as moral licensing, the idea that when we feel confident about our goodness, we give ourselves unconscious permission to act badly without registering it as bad behavior. We have a surplus of moral credit, and the brain quietly spends it without informing us. But there is something even more precise underneath this, something that evolutionary psychologists have described in terms of the brain's fundamental architecture. Human beings are not built at the deepest level to make independent moral judgments in hierarchical social contexts. We are built, after millions of years of evolution in small groups where defiance of a leader could mean death or exile, to be exquisitely sensitive to authority, to social role, to the expectations of whoever controls the resources and the safety of the group. This is not a flaw in human character. It was, for the vast majority of human evolutionary history, an adaptive feature. The individual who could read the social hierarchy quickly and align their behavior with its demands was the individual who survived, who was fed, who was protected, who reproduced. The individual who insisted on independent moral judgment in the face of group consensus was the individual who got expelled. What this means, in the architecture of the brain, is that the neural circuitry for social conformity is older, faster, and more deeply embedded than the circuitry for independent moral reasoning. When those two systems conflict, when the social expectation says one thing and your individual conscience says another, the social system does not lose quietly. It wins with such efficiency that most people never notice the contest took place. They simply find themselves doing what the situation requires of them, and they experience it not as capitulation, but as choice. They have a reason. The reason makes sense to them, and the reason is almost never, I am complying because my brain is responding to a dominance hierarchy. Because that is not how the brain narrates its own functioning. The guards at Stanford did not think, I am choosing to be cruel. They thought, this prisoner needs to be disciplined. This situation requires control. I am doing my job. The brain had already decided. The reasoning came after. This is what psychologists call post hoc rationalization, and it is not a rare or exceptional phenomenon. It is the default mode of human moral cognition. We act first, in response to situation and context and role. We reason second, to explain to ourselves and others why what we did was justified. The feeling of having chosen freely, of having deliberated. That feeling is real, but it often describes a process that happened in a different order than it feels like it happened. If you've reached this point in the video and you're feeling unsettled in a way that feels important, that feeling is the point. Subscribing to the human code means the next time we go somewhere like this, you'll be there. Philip Zimbardo's career did not end with the Stanford Prison Experiment. He spent decades afterward developing what he called situationist psychology, the systematic evidence-based study of how circumstances shape behavior. He wrote extensively about Abu Ghraib, the military prison in Iraq, where American soldiers photographed themselves torturing detainees in 2003. And he argued not to excuse them, but to explain them, that what happened at Abu Ghraib was not a story about bad soldiers. It was a story about a situation that had all the same features as the Stanford basement. Dehumanization of the people being guarded, ambiguous authority, permission structures that normalized cruelty. A social environment in which the guards' peer group rewarded harshness and punished hesitation. Zimbardo testified at the court-martial of one of the Abu Ghraib soldiers. He argued that the situational forces were powerful enough to constitute a form of mitigating circumstance. The court did not fully accept this argument, and this is where the ethics of situationist psychology get genuinely difficult. Because if you fully accept the situational explanation, if you agree that circumstances can override character so completely that individuals cannot be held responsible, you have described a world in which moral accountability is essentially impossible. A world in which no one is ever really choosing anything. Zimbardo did not go that far. He was careful to say that situational forces are extraordinarily powerful without being absolute, that knowing about them, being trained to recognize them, developing the capacity to step outside the pole of a situation and ask whether what you are doing aligns with who you want to be. These things matter. They are not a complete defense, but they are not nothing either. Christina Masloch had the same situational pressures as everyone else in that building. She was also in a relationship with the study's architect. Her refusal to be absorbed by the institutional logic was not effortless. It was, by her own account, genuinely difficult, but it was possible. What she had, that the guards and even Zimbardo had temporarily lost, was what researchers in this area call perspective discontinuity, the experience of looking at a situation from the outside, from a vantage point that interrupts the flow of normalized behavior. She had not been there for the first 5 days. She came in fresh. She had not been slowly habituated to the cage and its rules. She saw it the way a person from outside sees it, with immediate recognition that something was wrong. This is why the boiling frog phenomenon, though it is neurologically inaccurate as a description of actual frogs, is so accurate as a description of human moral habituation. The escalation of cruelty at Stanford was not sudden. Day 1 involved some push-ups and roll calls and humiliation that was, by the standards of actual prisons, relatively mild. Day 2, it was worse. Day 3, it was worse still. Each increment was small enough that it felt like a continuation of what had already been accepted, rather than a new choice. The guards were not deciding each day to be crueler than the day before. They were simply doing what had become normal in this context, and normal had been slowly redefined around them. Here's the thing that most people do not expect to learn about Zimbardo. He was not the first person to conduct this kind of research, and the results of the Stanford Prison Experiment were not, within the psychological research community, actually surprising. They confirmed what a series of earlier experiments had already demonstrated. Experiments that Zimbardo knew intimately and that had shaped his entire theoretical framework. Stanley Milgram had conducted his obedience studies at Yale between 1961 and 1963, 8 years before the Stanford Prison Experiment. Milgram's design was simpler and, in its simplicity, perhaps even more disturbing. Participants were told they were in a study of learning and memory. They were asked to administer electric shocks to another person who was actually a Confederate, an actor in the experiment, whenever that person got a question wrong. The shock generator had a dial that ran from 15 volts, labeled slight shock, to 450 volts, labeled danger, severe shock, and then beyond that, simply XXX. The shocks were fake. The screams of the supposed victim heard through a wall were recorded. The person was never actually harmed. 65% of participants administered the maximum shock. Not 65% of people who were somehow predisposed to cruelty. 65% of a sample of ordinary Americans recruited from newspaper advertisements who had come to a university to participate in a research study. When the experimenter simply said things like, "Please continue," or "The experiment requires that you continue," most people continued all the way to what they believed was a potentially lethal level of electricity, administered to a person they had just met and had no reason to harm. Before running his study, Milgram had asked groups of psychiatrists, college students, and middle-class adults to predict how many people would go all the way to 450 volts. The psychiatrists predicted less than 1%. The others predicted similarly low numbers. Everyone vastly underestimated the power of the situation. Everyone thought most people would stop, and then almost nobody stopped. This is the predictable pattern in this research, across decades and replications and variations. Before the situation, people vastly overestimate their own resistance. After the situation, they vastly underestimate the pressure it exerted on them, because compliance feels like choice from the inside, and it is only from the outside that you can see the mechanism for what it is. There is a related study, less famous than Milgram or Stanford, but in some ways more personally relevant, because it takes place in an environment that most people think of as morally safe, that demonstrates this with a particular elegance. In 1973, John Darley and Daniel Batson conducted what became known as the Good Samaritan study at Princeton Theological Seminary. Seminary students, people who had chosen to spend their lives studying and practicing moral behavior, people whose entire professional identity was built around the idea of compassion, were asked to give a talk. Some were told to talk about the parable of the Good Samaritan. Others were told to talk about job opportunities for seminary graduates. Before the talk, some participants were told they were late and needed to hurry. Others were told they had plenty of time. On the way to the talk, each participant passed a person slumped in a doorway, clearly in distress, who appeared to need help. Whether the seminary students stopped to help was predicted almost entirely by one variable: whether they were in a hurry. Students who had been told they were late were far less likely to stop, even when they were on their way to give a talk about the Good Samaritan. The content of their moral thinking, what they were literally about to say about the obligation to stop and help, had almost no effect on their behavior. The situational pressure, the sense of time constraint, of obligation to arrive, of not wanting to disappoint the person waiting for them, overrode it almost completely. Some of these seminary students in a hurry literally stepped over the slump person on their way to talk about helping strangers. This is not a story about hypocrites. Hypocrisy implies awareness, knowing the right thing and doing the wrong thing deliberately. What Darley and Batson found was something more troubling. People acting against their deeply held values without being aware that they were doing it, because a situational pressure had reprioritized their attention before their conscious value system had time to engage. What does the brain do in these moments? What is actually happening physiologically when a person with good values is placed in a situation that produces bad behavior? The neuroscience of this is now reasonably well understood, even if it is still being refined. When we are placed in a social context with clear authority and clear role expectations, the brain's threat response system, centered in the amygdala, deeply connected to the stress hormone axis, begins generating a particular kind of signal that is not experienced consciously as threat, but rather as the feeling of social pressure, of being watched, of obligation. This signal is processed before the prefrontal cortex, the region associated with deliberate moral reasoning, has time to evaluate it. The brain has, in effect, already responded to the situation before the part of us that thinks about right and wrong has been consulted. This is not the same as saying that moral reasoning is irrelevant, or that the prefrontal cortex never wins. It does sometimes win. The data is clear that certain conditions make independent moral judgment more likely. Being outside the immediate situational context, having prior training in recognizing these mechanisms, having a single other person who also dissents, having been asked in advance to think about what you would do in exactly this situation. These factors genuinely matter. They are the factors that explain Christina Maslach and the roughly 35% of Milgram's participants who did not administer the maximum shock, and the seminary students who were not in a hurry. But they are factors. They are conditions that shift the probability. They do not describe a switch that some people have and others don't. They describe variables that make an already difficult thing somewhat more possible. The act of choosing the harder path against a strong situational current, in the moment, in real time, without the benefit of hindsight. Now, here is the unexpected detail about this research that tends to arrive about 40 minutes into any serious reading about it. The detail that reframes everything that came before it. The Stanford Prison Experiment, as it was originally reported, may have been significantly different from what actually happened. In 2018, a French documentary filmmaker named Thibault Letexier published a book called Debunking the Stanford Prison Experiment that drew on previously unpublished archival materials, hours of recordings, guard training sessions, internal notes, to argue that what happened in the basement of Jordan Hall was not a spontaneous emergence of situational cruelty. It was, at least in part, directed. The recording showed Zimbardo and his colleagues giving the guards specific guidance before the experiment began, telling them to be tough, to not show sympathy, to create a sense of fear and helplessness in the prisoners. One recording captured Zimbardo explaining to a guard that they needed to feel a constant sense of oppression. Another showed a guard being coached on how to behave more harshly. The question of whether this constituted direction or suggestion is debated. But it means that the guard's cruelty was not purely emergent. It was seeded. This does not invalidate the findings of the experiment, but it complicates them in ways that Zimbardo's original account did not acknowledge. And when confronted with Letexier's research, Zimbardo's responses were, by many accounts, not as honest or reflective as his own writings about the experiment might have predicted. He disputed the characterization vigorously. He minimized the significance of the coaching. He was, by many observers' accounts, protective of his narrative in ways that were more institutional than scientific. There is an irony here that is almost painful in its completeness. The man who spent his career arguing that people protect the institutions they are embedded in rather than the truth. The man who described how even observers become captured by the situations they are studying was observed at the end of his career doing exactly that, protecting the experiment, protecting the role, finding reasons to doubt the evidence that complicated the story he had built. This does not make Zimbardo a bad person. It makes him a human being. It makes him a demonstration in his own life of the very thesis he spent decades proving. In the years since the Stanford Prison Experiment, the core situationist thesis has been refined and nuanced and in some areas genuinely challenged. Personality psychologists have pushed back against what they see as an overcorrection, the idea that character doesn't matter at all. The most current consensus in social and personality psychology is what researchers call interactionism, the recognition that behavior is shaped by both stable dispositional traits and situational forces, and that the interaction between them is where the real explanatory power lies. Some people, in some situations, are genuinely more likely to resist. Character is not fiction. Situational pressure is not everything, but the direction and the magnitude of the correction, even in its most refined interactionist form, is still deeply humbling. Even the most personality-centric psychologists working today accept that situational forces are dramatically more powerful than popular intuition suggests. The general public still dramatically underestimates how much their behavior is shaped by context, role, and social expectation. The research consensus across dozens of well-replicated studies in multiple countries over more than 60 years is consistent on this point. Ordinary people, placed in extraordinary situations, reliably do things that they would have confidently predicted they would not do. The real-world parallels to this research are not difficult to find. They are not exotic. You do not have to look to prisons or psychology experiments to see situational forces capturing behavior. You can see it in any organization where a culture of silence around wrongdoing becomes normalized, where pointing out a problem is socially more costly than ignoring it, and where good people, people who in any other context would describe themselves as someone who speaks up, decide in the moment that this is not the right time, not the right situation, not their place to say something. You can see it in any group where conformity becomes the cost of belonging, where the gradual escalation of group behavior makes each increment feel like a small step rather than a choice. You can see it in the quiet, daily accumulation of small compliance decisions that no one experiences as significant, but that collectively produce outcomes that anyone looking from the outside would recognize immediately as wrong. This is what Zimbardo called the banality of evil, a phrase he borrowed from Hannah Arendt, who used it to describe Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi bureaucrat who organized the logistics of the Holocaust and who, in his trial in Jerusalem in 1961, presented himself and appeared genuinely to believe himself to be an ordinary man who had simply done his job. Arendt's argument, which was enormously controversial when she first made it, was that Eichmann was not a monster in the conventional sense. He was a functionary who had so thoroughly internalized the institutional logic of the system he served that he had ceased to think of the people in the boxcars as people at all. The mechanism of dehumanization, the sunglasses, the numbers, the smocks, was not incidental to what happened in both the Nazi bureaucracy and the Stanford basement. It was the mechanism. Making the other person a category rather than a person is what makes cruelty sustainable. And this is where the research arrives at something that is not just psychologically interesting, but genuinely practical. Something that changes the shape of the question from what are people capable of to what makes resistance possible, and what makes it more likely. The research identifies several conditions that reliably interrupt the situational capture mechanism. The first and most powerful is prior awareness. People who have been taught explicitly and in advance about the psychology of situational compliance, who understand how the mechanism works, who have been trained to recognize the feeling of social pressure and to pause before acting on it. show significantly greater resistance in experimental conditions. This is one of the strongest arguments for why this research should be taught widely and taught young, not as a curiosity but as a practical form of psychological self-defense. The second condition is the presence of a single dissenter. In Milgram's follow-up studies, when a Confederate was introduced who refused to continue administering shocks, who said clearly and early, "This is wrong, I won't do this," the compliance rate among real participants dropped dramatically. One person saying no, in a situation where everyone else is saying yes, changes the social calculus in a way that transforms resistance from an act of deviance into an act of solidarity. You are no longer the one person who is wrong about what everyone else finds acceptable. You are joining someone else who is also right. The third condition is slowing down. The Good Samaritan study demonstrated that time pressure is one of the most reliable suppressors of independent moral judgment. The inverse is also true. When people have time to reflect, when the pace of events does not demand an immediate response, the prefrontal cortex has time to engage. Moral deliberation requires time. Situations designed to capture behavior are almost always designed, consciously or not, to eliminate that time, to create urgency, momentum, the sense that hesitation itself is a form of non-compliance. What this means in practice is that one of the most concrete things that can be taken from this research is an instruction to slow down in any situation where you feel social pressure to act quickly against your values. The urgency you feel is often the mechanism, not the situation. Philip Zimbardo lived until 2024. He spent the last decades of his life working on what he called the Heroic Imagination Project, an organization dedicated to training ordinary people to become what he called heroes of the everyday, people capable of acting against situational pressure in the moment of moral crisis rather than in the safe distance of retrospect. He had arrived at the end of a career built on showing people what they were capable of doing wrong, at the belief that the same research that describes situational capture also describes situational heroism, that the conditions which made cruelty possible were the mirror image of conditions that made courage possible, and that understanding the mechanism gave you, if nothing else, a chance. He founded that project because he had looked at his own behavior in that basement in August of 1971, and he knew, with a precision that only comes from genuine self-examination rather than self-excusing, that he had not been the hero of his own story. He had been captured. He had hesitated when he should have opened the cell. He had found a reason to wait, and he had spent the rest of his life trying to understand that moment well enough to give other people the tools he had not had when he needed them. The Stanford Prison Experiment is not, ultimately, a story about power. It is a story about a particular kind of knowledge. The kind that arrives when you see a human being for the first time as a function of their situation rather than only as a function of their character. It is uncomfortable knowledge. It does not let you be certain about yourself in the way that you would like to be. It asks you to hold the possibility that you, in different circumstances, with different role assignments and different social pressures and different gradual escalations of normalized behavior, might have been one of the guards. Not because you are secretly cruel, but because you are human. Because the same neural architecture that makes you capable of empathy and solidarity and genuine moral courage also makes you vulnerable to situational capture in conditions you have not been trained to recognize. Knowing this is not the same as being resigned to it. Zimbardo's own life is evidence of that. He saw what he had done. He named it clearly, which is harder than it sounds. He changed the direction of his remaining work because of it. Masloch's intervention, which lasted by most accounts less than an hour, ended the experiment and saved the remaining participants from what might have been another 9 days of escalating harm. One person, seeing clearly, speaking clearly, can interrupt the mechanism. It has been interrupted. It continues to be interrupted. The data on this is also real. What it costs to know this about ourselves is a kind of comfortable certainty we would rather not give up. The certainty that we are different, that we have known ourselves clearly for long enough to be confident about how we would behave in conditions we have never encountered, that our values would hold against forces we have never actually faced. The data says that certainty is not earned. It says that resistance, Real functional, effective moral resistance in the moment of situational pressure is a skill, not a trait. Skills are built, traits are inherited and counted on, and then discovered to be insufficient in the worst possible moment. There were 24 men selected from 75 applicants for the Stanford Prison Experiment. Every one of them was assessed as normal. Every one of them was, by every measurable indicator available to the researchers in the summer of 1971, a person who would have described themselves as unlikely to harm others. 12 of them were randomly assigned to be guards. Within 6 days, several of them had become people they could not have predicted. The question that the last 50 years of research in this field has been building toward is not whether this can happen. That question is settled. The question is simpler and more personal, and it is the one that this research, at its most honest, places directly in front of you. Think of a situation in your own life, not a hypothetical prison, not a psychology experiment, but a real situation, one that you have actually been in, where you went along with something that you knew on some level was wrong, where the social pressure or the role you were in or the institutional logic of the environment you were in made compliance feel more available than resistance. You do not have to share what it was, but you know what it is. That moment, the specific texture of it, the reason you found in that moment, the way it felt like a small thing at the time, that is where this research lives. Not in a basement in 1971. There. What do you think would have needed to be different in that moment for you to have been the one who said no?